The transport ship shuddered as it dropped through the golden atmosphere of Velaris Prime, and Sergeant Kale Morrow tightened his harness, while every other soldier in the cabin barely noticed the turbulence at all. He was the smallest one on the ship by far, surrounded by Kalori warriors who stood 8 feet tall with scales like hammered bronze, and Velari officers whose silver skin seemed to glow with an inner light that made Kale feel like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. "First time on a throne world human?" asked a Kalori corporal with teeth the size of Kale's thumb. "First time on any world that wasn't trying to kill me," Kale said, and the Kalori laughed because he thought it was a joke, but it was not. The city below them was something beyond imagination, with towers that twisted up into the clouds like frozen ribbons of glass and metal, bridges of light connecting them in patterns that hurt the eyes if you stared too long, and gardens that floated in midair because the Velari had mastered gravity the way humans had mastered fire. A long time ago, and so completely that they had forgotten it was ever difficult. Kale's wrist unit buzzed, and a familiar voice filled his earpiece. "Welcome to Velaris Prime, Sergeant," said Emmy, his onboard AI companion, her voice dry and flat the way he liked it. "The air is breathable, the gravity is 12% above Earth standard, and you are the only human within 6-star systems." "Wonderful. Also, your dress uniform has a stain on the left sleeve." "Even better." The transport settled onto a landing platform that was polished to such a shine that Kale could see his own reflection. A stocky, scarred man with short brown hair and tired eyes, standing among giants and angels and looking exactly like what he was, ordinary. Commander Drothek was waiting at the platform's edge, his massive reptilian frame casting a shadow long enough to swallow 3 men, and when he saw Kale step off the ramp, he let out a low rumble that was the Kalori version of a disappointed sigh. "So they actually sent you," Drothek said. "They actually sent me. 1 human, for the biggest security operation in a century. I'm told I count for diversity points." Drothek leaned down until his amber eyes were level with Kale's, and his breath was hot and smelled like copper. "Listen to me carefully, Morrow. You are here because the Conquered needed to check a box that said human representation on a form somewhere. And that is the only reason, so stay quiet, stay out of the way, and do not embarrass your species." Kale just nodded because he had heard speeches like this before, on his first deployment, on his second, on every mission where he was the only human in a room full of beings who could crush him with one hand, or set his brain on fire with a thought. The Century Summit was the largest diplomatic gathering in the Galactic Conquered, held once every 100 years on a rotating host world. And this year the Velari Dominion had the honor, which meant that the entire palace complex had been transformed into a fortress of ceremony and paranoia. Over 300 species would be represented, and each one had sent their finest delegates, their sharpest minds, their most dangerous bodyguards. And then there was Kale, who had been sent because someone in human military command thought it would look good on a report. The security briefing was held in a chamber so vast that Kale's voice would have echoed if anyone had asked him to speak, which they did not. He stood at the back and listened, while Velari security chiefs outlined their defensive grid, psionic barrier networks, telepathic surveillance sweeps, energy shields that could withstand orbital bombardment, and guard rotations staffed by warriors who could read hostile intent before it fully formed in an attacker's mind. It was impressive, and Kale had only one thought. They were completely reliant on psionics. Every layer of defense, every detection system, every contingency plan assumed that the defenders would have access to their psionic abilities at all times, and if that assumption broke, the whole thing collapsed like a house built on sand. He was about to leave when a voice stopped him. "You are the human." He turned and found himself face to face with Princess Silvari Tonriel, and she was exactly what the intelligence briefings had described: tall, luminous, with eyes like liquid silver, and an expression that suggested she was examining something mildly interesting she had found under a rock. "Sergeant Kale Morrow, Your Highness. I have studied your species," she said, tilting her head in a way that reminded Kale of a bird watching a worm. 40 years in the Concord and still no psionic development at all. Is it true that you communicate exclusively through sound and visual symbols? "We call it talking, Your Highness." "Fascinating," she said, though the word sounded more like a diagnosis than a compliment. "And your weapons still use chemical propellants, controlled explosions to launch metal fragments." "We call those guns, Your Highness." Something flickered in her silver eyes, amusement or pity. He could not tell which, and she moved on without another word, her attendants flowing behind her like a stream of silk and starlight. Kale watched her go, and then made his way to the lower engineering levels of the palace, because that was where the real security of any structure lived. Not in the grand halls or the shining towers, but in the ugly mechanical guts where power was generated, and shields were maintained, and nobody glamorous ever bothered to look. The corridors down here were narrow and dimly lit, designed for maintenance drones rather than people, and Kale moved through them with a scanner in one hand and a flashlight in the other while Emmy cataloged everything in his earpiece. "The Velari Guard roster shows 0 patrols below level 14, Emmy noted. "Because they scan everything with psionics from above. Why walk through tunnels when you can sense every molecule from a throne room?" "A reasonable question. Unless someone finds a way to block the psionics." He spent 3 hours down there, crawling through conduits and checking junction boxes, and on the 7th shield generator substation, he found it, micro-fractures in the power coupling housings, barely visible to the naked eye but unmistakable to a combat engineer who had spent 10 years learning how infrastructure fails. These fractures were not natural wear. They were precise, deliberate, and positioned so that a single triggered cascade would bring the generator down in seconds. He checked the next substation and found the same thing, and the next and the next. Somebody had sabotaged the palace shield generators, and they had done it slowly and carefully over what must have been weeks or months, and no one had noticed because the psionic sensors only checked for energy signatures, not physical damage. Kale filed his report through the proper channels and waited. The response came within the hour. A Velari technician reviewed his findings remotely and dismissed them, stating that human scanning equipment was insufficiently calibrated for Velari engineering tolerances, and that the microfractures were within acceptable parameters for crystalline power matrices. Kale stared at the dismissal notice on his screen for a long time. "They are not listening," Emmy said. "No, they are not. What would you like to do?" He closed the message and pulled up a blank log file instead, and he began to document everything, every fracture, every generator, every measurement, every timestamp, in the meticulous, obsessive way that humans had been recording things since they first scratched marks on cave walls to count the days between floods. "We do what we always do, Emmy. We write it down, we save it, and we keep our eyes open because sooner or later someone is going to wish they had listened. And if they never listen, then at least we will know we were right, and that is going to have to be enough for now." Outside the engineering levels, the palace hummed with light and laughter, and the electric anticipation of 300 species coming together under one roof, and not a single one of them knew that the floor beneath their feet was already cracked and waiting to break. The Century Summit opened with a ceremony that lasted 6 hours, and involved singing in frequencies that human ears could not fully hear, light displays that painted the sky above the palace in colors that human eyes could not fully see, and speeches in languages so ancient that even the universal translators struggled to keep up. Kale stood at his assigned post near the Eastern Gallery and watched the crowd instead of the ceremony, because that was what soldiers did. They watched the spaces between the beautiful things where the ugly things like to hide. 300 species filled the grand hall, and each one was extraordinary in its own way. The Kaelori with their armored hides and warrior pride, the Thessari who floated on magnetic fields and communicated through pulses of light, the Dren who had 4 arms and could process information faster than most computers, and dozens more that Kale could not name but could describe by their threat profile, their weapon preferences, and how quickly they could close a 20-meter gap. And then there were the Velari, their hosts, who moved through the crowd like living sculptures of silver and starlight, their psionic energy so potent that even Kale, who could not sense psionics at all, could feel a faint pressure behind his eyes when too many of them gathered in one place. Princess Silvari was among them, dressed in something that looked like woven moonlight, and she played her role perfectly, smiling, greeting, flattering, and making every delegate feel as though they were the most important being in the room. But twice during the evening Kale caught her looking at him from across the hall, and each time she looked away quickly, and that told him something interesting. She was not looking at him because she found him amusing. She was looking at him because something about him bothered her, and a person who is bothered is a person who is thinking. The reception that followed was louder and less formal, and Kale used the opportunity to move through the crowd, listening to fragments of conversation, mapping exits, counting guards, and noting the positions of the security stations that blinked with soft blue light along the walls. "You are the only one doing this," Emmy said in his ear. "Doing what?" "Actually working." She was right. Every other guard in the room had relaxed into the social atmosphere, drinking, talking, trusting the psionic surveillance net to catch any threat before it materialized. And why wouldn't they? Because it had worked for centuries and no one had ever breached a Velari security grid. Not once. But Kale had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment in any operation was the moment when everyone decided that nothing could go wrong. He was cataloging the emergency exits on the north wall when a voice came from behind him, calm and curious, and carrying the weight of someone who was used to being the smartest person in every room. "You have not eaten, you have not spoken to anyone, and you have circled this hall 4 times, Princess Silvari said. "What exactly are you doing, Sergeant?" "My job, Your Highness." "Your job is to stand at your post and look decorative, which you are failing at quite thoroughly." "I was never much good at decorative." She studied him the way she had before, with that tilted head and those silver eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. And then she did something unexpected. She fell into step beside him and walked with him. "I tried to read your mind this afternoon," she said, as casually as someone might mention the weather. "How did that go?" "It didn't. There was nothing there to read. Not a wall, not a shield, just nothing, like trying to hear a sound in a vacuum. And I have never encountered that before. Humans are not psionic. There is nothing to connect to. I know that intellectually, but experiencing it is different. Every other species in the Conquered has at least a trace of psionic resonance, even the ones who cannot use it actively, but you are simply blank, and it is deeply unsettling." They walked in silence for a moment, passing through a corridor of crystalline pillars that sang faintly as air currents moved through them, and Kale wondered why a princess of the most powerful empire in the galaxy was spending her evening talking to the one person in the palace who could not impress her. "What is it like?" she asked suddenly. "What is what like?" "Being so limited, no psionics, no natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no regeneration, no exoskeleton. Your species has none of the advantages that every other conquered member evolved with. So what is it like to exist in a galaxy where everything is stronger, faster, and more capable than you are?" It was a blunt question, and from anyone else it might have been insulting, but Silvari asked it with genuine curiosity, the kind that came from someone who had spent her whole life studying alien species in books and had never actually talked to one as though it were her equal. Kale thought about it for a moment. "We learn to pay attention," he said. "When you cannot sense danger psionically, you have to see it coming with your eyes. When you cannot overpower a predator, you have to outsmart it. When you cannot regenerate from a wound, you have to learn how to avoid getting wounded in the first place. And when you fail at all of that, you have to be too stubborn to die." That sounds exhausting. It is, but it also means we never stop watching, and we never stop thinking, and we never assume that we are safe just because we feel safe. Something shifted in her expression, not respect exactly, but the beginning of a question she did not yet know how to ask, and she left him with a small nod that was different from the polished diplomatic gestures she gave everyone else. This one was real. That night, while the palace slept, and the psionic security grid hummed its silent song of watchfulness over the dreaming delegates, Kale sat in his small quarters and worked. He had traced the sabotage generators to a supply chain. The replacement parts that had been used in their last maintenance cycle had come from a specific fabrication facility, and that facility was owned by a subsidiary of a trading consortium that was, after 7 layers of corporate structure, controlled by Lord Valith of House Riel. Valith was a Velari noble of the old school, ancient family, vast wealth, and a deep resentment of the Empress's policy of opening the Dominion to conquered influence. And Kale had found references in public records to speeches Valith had given about preserving Velari purity and the contamination of lesser species. None of this was proof. It was patterns, logistics, serial numbers, and the kind of tedious manual detective work that nobody with psionic abilities would ever bother with, because why would you trace shipping manifests when you could simply read the suspect's mind? Except that you could not read a mind that knew it was being watched, and the Velari nobility had centuries of practice at shielding their thoughts from each other. "You have something," Emmy said. "I have a theory." "You have more than a theory, you have evidence, circumstantial but extensive." "Circumstantial does not move mountains, Emmy. Not on a world where the people in power think my scanning equipment is too crude, and my species is too primitive to understand what we are looking at." "Then what will move them?" Something going wrong in a way they cannot ignore." The next day, it happened. A minor systems failure during the summit's afternoon session knocked out lighting in the West Wing for exactly 90 seconds before backup systems restored power, and every Velari technician declared it a routine fluctuation, a minor inconvenience, nothing to worry about. But Kale had been watching the engineering telemetry, and he knew what he was looking at. It was not a failure. It was a test, someone checking whether the cascade sequence would work, whether the generators would fall in the right order, whether the gap in the shield grid would open wide enough. He went to Drothic that evening and laid everything out: the sabotage generators, the supply chain, the connection to Valith, the test run. Drothic listened with his massive arms crossed and his amber eyes unreadable, and when Kale finished, the Kalori commander let out a long, slow breath. "You are asking me to accuse a Velari lord of treason on his own world, based on shipping records and microfractures that his own technicians have already dismissed. I am telling you what I found. And I believe you. I have served with humans before, and you are many things, but you are not careless. But belief is not enough here, Morrow. I need proof that even Velari pride cannot argue with, and you have not given me that." Kale nodded because he knew Drothic was right, and he went back to his quarters. And he asked Emmy to do one more thing. Model the shield generator failures as a coordinated attack sequence. Assume all sabotage generators fail simultaneously, and tell me how long the palace defensive grid stays down. Emmy ran the numbers in 3 seconds. 11 minutes. If all compromised generators are triggered at once, the internal shield grid drops for 11 minutes before emergency backups can reroute power. 11 minutes with no shields, no psionic barriers, and no internal defenses in a palace filled with every important leader in the galaxy. Kale sat in the dark and stared at the number on his screen, and he felt the old familiar weight settle into his chest. The weight that came from knowing something terrible was coming and not being able to stop it. Emmy, prep everything, every scan, every log, every file, and keep it ready. Because when this thing breaks, it is going to break fast, and we are going to be the only ones who saw it coming. Understood, Sergeant, for what it is worth. I think the princess is beginning to see it too. She is beginning to see something. Whether it is enough remains to be seen. Outside his window, the towers of Velaris Prime glittered like a jeweler's dream against the dark sky, and somewhere in that beautiful city, a lord was counting down the hours until everything burned. The banquet hall was the size of a small city, and it was filled with the sound of 300 species laughing and arguing and celebrating under a ceiling that had been engineered to display a live image of the stars above Velaris Prime, so that the delegates ate and drank beneath an ocean of light that slowly turned as the planet rotated. Kale stood at his post near the southern entrance and counted the exits for the 11th time: 4 main doors, 2 service corridors, 1 emergency shaft behind the stage, and a maintenance hatch in the floor near the kitchens that nobody else knew about because nobody else had crawled through the sublevel tunnels to find it. His earpiece was quiet, and the psionic security grid was humming its steady song of all clear, and every guard in the room was relaxed and smiling, and Kale's hands would not stop shaking. Not from fear, from recognition, because he had felt this before, this terrible stillness before the storm, this moment where the world holds its breath and everything looks perfect and peaceful, and you know in your bones that it is about to shatter. Emmy, what is the status on the compromised generators? All still active, all still within what the Velari call acceptable parameters. And Valith. Lord Valith is seated at the 3rd table from the Empress, smiling, drinking, and showing no signs of. The lights went out. Not flickered, not dimmed, went out. All at once. Every light in the banquet hall dying in the same instant like 1,000 candles snuffed by a single breath. And the darkness that followed was so absolute and so sudden that, for one heartbeat, the entire room was silent. Then the screaming started. But the darkness was not the worst of it. The worst came half a second later when a wave of something invisible and terrible swept through the palace like a silent hurricane, and every psionic being in the room felt their minds go blind. Kale could not feel psionics, so he did not feel them vanish, but he could see the effect. Velari guards stumbled and clutched their heads. Kalori warriors roared in confusion as their enhanced senses went dark. Thessari delegates crashed to the floor as their magnetic levitation failed, and 100 other species reacted in 100 different ways to the sudden and total loss of the abilities they had relied on since birth. Psionic dampeners, military grade, mounted throughout the palace, activated in perfect synchronization with the shield generator cascade. Someone had planned this very carefully. Emmy. I am still here, Sergeant. My systems are hardened against EMP and psionic interference. The palace shield grid is down. Internal psionic network is down. Communications are jammed on all frequencies except short-range hardline. How long? Based on our models, 11 minutes before emergency, backups can restore the grid. 11 minutes. Kale pulled his sidearm, a chemical propellant pistol, the kind that every other species in the Concord considered a museum piece, and racked the slide, and the sound of it was small and mechanical and utterly out of place in a hall full of beings who fought with plasma and thought. But plasma weapons needed the palace power grid to recharge, and psionic weapons needed psionic energy to function. And in this moment of perfect darkness and perfect silence, the only weapon in the room that still worked was the one built by a species too primitive to depend on anything they could not carry in their hands. The first explosion hit the eastern wall. The second hit the northern gate. And then the insurgents came pouring in, armored figures in black, shielded against their own dampeners, carrying kinetic weapons that did not need the grid, and they moved with the precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this assault 100 times. Kale was already moving before the second explosion faded, pushing through the panicked crowd toward the one person he knew he had to reach. Not the Empress, who was surrounded by her personal guard and was being rushed toward the throne room, but Princess Silvari, who was standing near the center of the hall with her hands pressed to her temples and her silver eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the explosions and everything to do with the silence inside her own mind. "Your Highness," he grabbed her arm and she flinched so hard she nearly fell. "We need to move right now. I cannot hear anything. I cannot feel anything. My mind is empty. What is happening to me?" "Psionic dampeners, your abilities are suppressed. Not gone, they will come back, but right now we need to go." He pulled her toward the maintenance hatch near the kitchens, and she followed because she had no choice. Because in a world without psionics, the tall, luminous princess was as helpless as a child, and the small, scarred human was the only person in the room who was still thinking clearly. They dropped through the hatch into the sublevel corridor, and Kale sealed it behind them and switched on his flashlight, a simple chemical battery light, the kind that worked without power grids or psionic networks or anything except a button and a bulb. "Where are we?" Silvari's voice was shaking. "Maintenance sublevel. I mapped these corridors 3 days ago during the security sweep that everyone told me was unnecessary." "You mapped them?" "With my eyes and a flashlight and a pencil, Your Highness, the old-fashioned way." They moved through the narrow tunnels, Kale leading with the flashlight in one hand and his pistol in the other, and Silvari following close behind, ducking under pipes and stepping over cables because these corridors had been built for drones, not for people, and certainly not for a princess who had never been in a room without climate control. They found Drothek at the junction of 2 corridors, bleeding from a gash on his arm and carrying a Kalori blade because his plasma rifle was dead, and with him were 6 other soldiers from the peacekeeping battalion. 3 Kalori, 2 Dren, and a Thessari who was using a wall-mounted power conduit to stay afloat since her magnetic field was gone. "Morrow," Drothek said, and his voice held something it had never held before when addressing Kale, relief. "Commander, the insurgents are sweeping toward the Empress's throne room from the east and north. We need to establish a defensive line here at Junction 7 to block the southern approach, while the Empress's guard evacuates her through the service tunnels." "You know these tunnels." "I mapped every inch of them." Drothek looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was the death of every assumption the Kalori warrior had ever made about humans. "Then lead, Morrow." Kale led. He positioned the Kalori at the 2 widest corridor intersections, because their size made them living barricades, and he put the Dren at the rear with their 4 arms ready to manage multiple weapons, and he gave the Thessari a communication role, tapping into the hardline network that still functioned in the sublevels. Then he built barricades out of maintenance crates, welded doors shut using a cutting torch from the engineering bay, and rigged a warning system out of loose cables and empty containers that would rattle if anyone came through the eastern tunnel. "This is primitive," one of the Kalori said, looking at the makeshift alarm. "This is what works," Kale said. "Right now we are all baseline, no psionics, no shields, no tech, so we fight the way my species has always fought. With whatever we have, and wherever we stand." The insurgents found them 12 minutes into the crisis, a squad of 8 in black armor pushing through the southern corridor, and the fight that followed was nothing like the elegant psionic battles the Velari wrote poems about. It was brutal, ugly, close-quarters violence in a dark tunnel lit by a single flashlight, and it was exactly the kind of fight that humanity had been training for since the first cave dweller picked up a rock. Kale took a blade across the ribs in the first 30 seconds, and he felt the pain like a white fire burning through his side. And he kept fighting because that was what humans did. They bled and they kept going. They hurt and they kept going. They were afraid and they kept going. Because 10,000 years of evolution on a world that wanted them dead had burned one truth into their bones. You do not stop until it is over. He field-dressed the wound with one hand while calling out positions to Drothek with his voice, and Sfi-fi watched him from behind the barricade with her silver eyes wide and her mouth open. And what she saw was not a primitive species fumbling in the dark. What she saw was a predator, not the biggest, not the fastest, not the strongest, but the most relentless, the most adaptive, the most terrifyingly calm thing she had ever witnessed, fighting in conditions that would have broken any other species in the Conquered, because these were the conditions his species had been born in. They held the line. They held it with blood and noise and stubborn fury. And when the last insurgent fell and the corridor went quiet, Kale leaned against the wall and breathed through the pain and looked at his ragged team of alien soldiers who were staring at him with something none of them could name. "The Empress," he said through gritted teeth, "is she clear?" Emmy's voice came through his earpiece, steady as always. "The Empress has been evacuated through Service Tunnel 9, the route you identified in your security survey, Sergeant." Sfi-fi stood in the dim light of the maintenance corridor with blood on her moonlight dress and silence where her psionic senses should have been. And she looked at the human who was bleeding from his ribs and still standing, still thinking, still fighting. And for the first time in her life, the princess of the Velari Dominion felt something she had never felt before. She felt small. The deep engineering sublevel smelled like oil and copper and fear. And the group of survivors huddled there looked nothing like the proud warriors and elegant diplomats they had been an hour ago. Drothek sat against a wall with his wounded arm wrapped in a torn piece of his own uniform, his amber eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if he could see through it to the palace, above where insurgents now controlled every major corridor. The 3 Kalori soldiers were quiet for the first time since Kale had met them, their confidence shattered along with their psionic senses, and the 2 Dren were running calculations with their 4 hands moving in nervous patterns that meant they were frightened and trying to hide it. The Thessari had found a powered conduit to cling to and hovered 2 feet off the ground with her light pulse communication, flickering in anxious patterns that nobody could read, because the translators needed the network to function. And Princess Sfi-fi sat on an overturned crate with her hands folded in her lap, looking like a woman who had just discovered that the ground she had stood on her entire life was made of glass. Kale was the only one standing, and he was the only one working. He had spread a maintenance schematic across a flat panel, not a holographic display because those were dead, but an actual printed emergency diagram that had been bolted inside a panel cover probably 100 years ago and never looked at since. And he was marking positions with a grease pencil while Emmy fed him data through his earpiece. "The situation is this," he said, and his voice was calm and clear despite the wound in his side that he had stitched shut with a field kit while everyone watched in horrified fascination. "Valeth controls the palace interior. His forces hold the throne room, the main halls, and the communication center. The Empress is safe in the evacuation bunker beneath the South Tower, but she is trapped there, and the conquered fleet is in orbit with enough firepower to end this in 10 minutes. But they cannot breach the planetary shield." "Valeth kept the orbital shields active," Drothek said. "He shut down the internal grid to let his forces in, but he left the orbital defenses running to keep the conquered out. It is smart. It means he only has to fight the people already inside the palace, and most of those people are currently stumbling around in the dark without their primary senses." "So we are trapped," one of the Kalori said. "We are inside," Kale corrected. "There is a difference." He pointed to 3 locations on the schematic, 3 generator substations spread across the lower levels of the palace, each one marked with the grease pencil in a circle. These are the three primary shield generators that feed the internal defensive grid. They are the ones that were sabotaged, and they are the ones we need to restart. If we can bring them back online simultaneously, the internal shields will reactivate. The psionic dampeners will be overwhelmed by the grid's energy feedback, and the conquered fleet will be able to use the restored internal sensors to coordinate a targeted breach of the orbital shields. "You want to retake the generators," Drothik said. "I want to flip 3 switches. Everything else is just the walk to get there." 3 generators, 3 teams, simultaneous activation. How do we coordinate without communications? Kale reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 small objects that made every alien in the room stare at him, as though he had lost his mind. They were watches, mechanical wristwatches, analog, with tiny hands that moved in circles powered by nothing but a wound spring. Kale carried them because he was a combat engineer, and combat engineers learned early that the universe would take away every advantage you had except the ones you carried in your pockets. We synchronize, we move, we count the minutes, and we hit the switches at exactly the same time. 3:47 hours, not a second before, not a second after. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when beings who have traveled between stars using the power of their minds are asked to coordinate a military operation using devices that were invented before humanity had electricity. "You are not serious," the Thessari flickered. "Humans landed on their moon using less computing power than what is in one of these watches," Kale said. "We are very serious about counting." He divided them into 3 teams. Drothik and 2 Kalori would take Generator 1 on the east side. The Dren and the Thessari would take Generator 3 on the north side, and Kale would take Generator 2 in the central core, the most heavily defended, the one closest to the throne room. "I am coming with you," Sfi-fi said. Every head turned to look at her. "Your Highness, with respect," Drothik began. "I am not asking permission, Commander. This is my world, my palace, and my people's failure that allowed this to happen, and I will not sit in a tunnel and wait for others to fix it." Kale studied her for a moment, this woman who had lost her greatest ability and was terrified and exhausted and still choosing to stand up, and he nodded. "Stay behind me, do exactly what I say, and if I tell you to run, you run without looking back." "Agreed." They synchronized the watches, 3 small circles of ticking metal held in hands that were scaled, 4-fingered and human, and then they moved out in 3 directions through the dark tunnels beneath a palace that had been built to last 10,000 years and was being taken back by soldiers using tools that were older than spaceflight. Kale and Sfi-fi moved through the central maintenance shaft, and the darkness was so complete that the flashlight beam felt like the only light left in the universe, and Kale moved through it the way a fish moves through water, naturally, instinctively, reading the shadows and the sounds and the vibrations in the floor with senses that were not psionic, but were sharp in ways that psionics could never replicate, because they had been honed by millions of years of being hunted by things with bigger teeth. "How can you see in this?" Sfi-fi whispered. "I cannot, I am listening." "Listening to what?" "Everything. The hum of the power conduits tells me which sections are active. The echo of our footsteps tells me the size of the space ahead. The air movement tells me whether a door is open or closed. Your species learned to sense the world with your minds. Mine learned to sense it with our bodies, and right now my way works, and yours does not." She was quiet after that, and Kale could feel her watching him with a new kind of attention, not the curiosity of a scholar studying a specimen, but the focus of a student watching a master. They reached the central generator level and found it guarded by 6 insurgents, and Kale stopped at the corner and assessed the situation in 3 seconds. 6 hostiles, 2 behind cover, 4 patrolling, all armed with kinetic rifles, the generator console 30 meters beyond them, and between here and there nothing but open floor and bad odds. "We cannot fight 6, Sfi-fi said. We are not going to fight 6. We are going to fight 2, and the other 4 are going to fight each other. He pulled 2 things from his engineering kit, a chemical flare and a sonic emitter that was designed for testing pipeline integrity, but could, if overloaded, produce a burst of sound that would disorient anyone within 20 meters. When I throw the flare left, the patrol will move toward it. When I trigger the sonic burst, the 2 behind cover will be stunned. The 4 in the open will think they are under attack from multiple directions because the sound will echo off 3 walls at different intervals, and in the confusion we move. That is insane. That is engineering. He checked his watch, 7 minutes to 3:47. The flare went left, bright red and screaming with chemical fire, and the patrol moved exactly the way Kale predicted because soldiers always moved toward the threat they could see. And the sonic burst hit like a physical wall of pressure that sent the 2 guards behind cover stumbling with their hands over their ears. And in the chaos of light and sound and echoing confusion, Kale moved through the gap like a ghost, firing twice, 2 shots, 2 guards down. And then he was at the console with Sfi-fi behind him, and the remaining insurgents shouting and firing in the wrong direction. "Cover the door," he said, and she grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and held it with both hands, and her aim was terrible but her willingness was absolute, and sometimes that was enough. Kale's hands moved across the console, bypassing the damaged circuits, rerouting power through backup channels, and preparing the manual restart sequence that the Velari had built into the system as a last resort, and then forgotten about because they never imagined they would need it. The remaining insurgents found them. They came through the east entrance firing, and Kale felt a round graze his shoulder and another shatter the console panel 2 inches from his hand. And he kept working because the watch on his wrist said 3:46 and he had 60 seconds to finish the sequence, and if he stopped now, everything was lost. Sfi-fi fired back, wild, untrained shots that hit nothing, but kept the insurgents ducking, and Kale entered the final code and put his hand on the activation lever. The watch ticked. He counted under his breath 58, 59. Somewhere in the east wing, Drothek would be standing at his generator with his massive hand on an identical lever, counting the same seconds. Somewhere in the north wing, 2 Dren and a floating Thessari would be doing the same. 3 teams, 3 generators, 3 watches ticking in perfect synchronization, because a human had handed them to aliens and said trust the counting. 3:47. Kale pulled the lever with his left hand and the concussion grenade's pin with his right, and he threw the grenade behind him toward the advancing insurgents and covered Sfi-fi with his body as the world turned white and loud. The generator roared to life beneath them, and somewhere deep in the bones of the palace, 2 other generators answered, and the hum that followed was not just mechanical. It was the sound of a civilization's defenses waking up, of shields snapping back into place, of psionic networks flooding back online like water breaking through a dam. Emmy's voice came through his earpiece, steady and warm and exactly on time. 11 minutes, Sergeant, right on schedule. Kale smiled with blood on his teeth and a grenade casing still in his hand, and then the world tilted sideways and went dark, and the last thing he heard was Sfi-fi screaming his name in a voice that no longer sounded like a princess. It sounded like a friend. Kale woke up in a bed that was too big for him, in a room that smelled like flowers he could not name, and the first thing he saw was a ceiling that glowed with soft, golden light that shifted like sunlight through water. He tried to sit up, and his body informed him in very clear terms that this was a terrible idea. 4 wounds stitched and sealed with Velari medical technology, a concussion that still rang behind his eyes like a bell, and muscles so exhausted that even breathing felt like a negotiation. "You are awake," Emmy said from his wrist unit, which someone had placed on the table beside the bed. "You have been unconscious for 14 hours, and in that time you have received 14 commendation notices, 3 medal nominations, and 7 requests for interviews from conquered media outlets. What happened after I went down? Shield grid reactivated across all sectors within seconds of the 3 generators coming online. The psionic dampeners were overwhelmed by the energy feedback exactly as you predicted. Conquered reinforcements breached the orbital perimeter within 4 minutes of the internal sensors coming back online, and the Empress's guard retook the palace in under an hour. Lord Valeth was captured attempting to flee through a private shuttle bay, and his entire network is being dismantled as we speak. Kale closed his eyes and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside his chest for 3 days. And the others, Drothek, the teams. Commander Drothek sustained a broken arm during his generator assault, but is otherwise fine. He has told 7 different people the story of how a human gave him a mechanical watch and asked him to count to victory, and each time he tells it the story gets slightly more dramatic. The Dren team completed their objective without casualties, and the Thessari has already filed a formal scientific inquiry into the engineering principles of spring-loaded timekeeping. Kale laughed, and it hurt, and he laughed again anyway because that was also a very human thing to do. He spent 2 days in the medical wing, healing at a rate that the Velari doctors found painfully slow, but that Kale found perfectly normal, because humans did not regenerate, they recovered, which was a slower and more stubborn process that involved a lot of sitting still and being frustrated about it. On the 3rd day, the Empress summoned him. The throne room had been repaired with impossible speed, the scars of battle erased, the walls restored to their luminous perfection, the great crystal throne gleaming at the far end of a hall filled with every delegate who had survived the summit. Kale walked the length of that hall in his dress uniform, the one with the stain on the left sleeve that he had not been able to get out, and he felt every eye in the room on him. 300 species watching a single human walk toward the most powerful ruler in the Velari dominion. The Empress was tall even by Velari standards, and her eyes were not silver like Silvari's but deep gold. And when she looked at Kale, it was with the steady gaze of someone who had ruled for 2 centuries and had learned to recognize the difference between what a person appeared to be and what they actually were. "Sergeant Kale Morrow," she said, and her voice carried through the hall without amplification because that was one of the things Velari could do. "You identified a threat that our psionic surveillance missed. You warned us and were ignored. And when the attack came, you organized a defense using methods my people had dismissed as obsolete, led soldiers from 4 different species through conditions that should have rendered all of you helpless. And retook 3 critical systems using nothing but mechanical tools and the discipline of your own training." She paused, and the silence in the hall was so complete that Kale could hear his own heartbeat. "I wish to understand something. Why did you continue when no one listened to you, when your warnings were dismissed, when you were told that your instruments were too crude and your species too primitive to comprehend what you were seeing?" Kale looked up at the Empress of the Velari Dominion, and he thought about the question for a moment, and then he gave the only honest answer he had. "It was the job, Your Majesty. The threat was real. And it did not matter whether anyone believed me because the sabotage did not care about my rank or my species or anyone's opinion of human technology. It was there, and it was going to hurt people. So I worked the problem. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. When the world is falling apart, humans do not wait for someone to tell them it is real. They pick up whatever tool is closest and they start fixing it." The Empress studied him for a long time, and something moved behind those golden eyes that might have been recognition, or admiration, or the quiet shock of a ruler who had just realized that the species she had tolerated as a political courtesy was something far more significant than she had ever imagined. "Your species has been in the Conquered for 40 years, she said, "and in that time we have treated you as guests, as newcomers to be observed and managed and kept at a comfortable distance. And I think, Sergeant, that this was a mistake. She stood from her throne, and every Velari in the room drew a sharp breath, because the Empress did not stand for anyone. The Conquered will establish a new joint tactical training initiative, integrating human combat doctrine and engineering methodology with the specialized capabilities of all member species. Humanity's seat at the Conquered table is no longer a courtesy. It is earned, and it is permanent. The applause that followed was not the polite ceremonial kind. It was real, and it was loud, and it came from species that 3 days ago had considered humans a footnote in galactic history. Kale nodded and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty," and walked back down the hall, and he kept his face steady and professional, and only Emmy could hear the slight unevenness in his breathing that meant the moment had hit him harder than he would ever admit. He found a quiet balcony overlooking the palace gardens, where the floating plants drifted in patterns that were beautiful and alien and peaceful, and he stood there for a while just breathing the golden air and feeling the extra 12% gravity pull at his tired bones. "Sergeant." He turned and found SEO Viral standing in the doorway, and she looked different than she had before, not in her appearance, which was still luminous and impossibly elegant, but in the way she held herself, as though something rigid inside her had been replaced with something more flexible and more honest. "Your Highness, I came to speak with you before you ship out." "About?" She walked to the railing and stood beside him, and for a moment they both looked out at the gardens in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who have been through something together that words are not quite large enough to hold. "I owe you an apology," she said at last. "Not for the condescension during the summit, though I am sorry for that too. I owe you an apology for every assumption I ever made about your species, every academic paper I read that classified humans as limited baseline organisms. Every time I looked at your kind and saw something lesser. You are not the first. No, but I intend to be the last, or at least the last in my family, because I watched you, Kale Morrow. I watched you fight with a hole in your side and a smile on your face. I watched you hand mechanical watches to warriors who could bend steel with their minds and tell them to trust the ticking. I watched you save my mother's empire with duct tape and stubbornness. And I have never in my life been so completely and thoroughly wrong about anything." Kale did not know what to say to that, because humans were very good at surviving catastrophe and very bad at accepting gratitude. So he did what humans always did when the emotional weight of a moment threatened to crush them. He deflected. "Do not spread it around. If the galaxy figures out we are useful, they will start giving us actual responsibilities. And we are only 40 years into this conquered thing. We were hopping to coast for at least another century." Silvari laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh. Not the polished diplomatic laugh she used at receptions, but a real one, bright and surprised and full of something that sounded like the beginning of a very long friendship. "I will keep your secret, Sergeant." "Much appreciated, Your Highness." She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, and the touch was light and formal and also not formal at all. And then she turned and walked back into the palace, and the last thing Kale saw before she disappeared was a look on her face that he recognized because he had seen it in the mirror 1,000 times, the look of someone whose world had gotten bigger. His transport shipped out that afternoon, rising through the golden atmosphere of Velaris Prime with a hold full of soldiers who had walked into a crisis as strangers and were leaving as something else. And Kale sat in his seat by the viewport and watched the throne world shrink beneath him until it was just a bright point of light among millions. His wrist unit buzzed. "Sergeant," Emmy said, "you have received a personal message from Princess Silvari Tonriel. Shall I read it?" "Go ahead." It reads, "The next time you visit, I will show you the gardens properly, and I would like you to tell me more about the moon landing, specifically the part about the counting." Kale smiled and leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. "Also," Emmy continued, Your combat pay still has not been adjusted for hazard duty. The requisition form appears to be stuck in Concord administrative processing. Estimated resolution time: 7 to 12 standard weeks. Of course it is. Shall I file a follow-up? File 3. If there is one thing humans are good at, it is paperwork. I thought it was stubbornness. Paperwork is just stubbornness in written form, Emmy. The transport broke through the atmosphere into the black silence of space, and the stars stretched out in every direction like an infinite field of possibilities. And somewhere down there, on a world of silver towers and floating gardens, a princess stood on a balcony and looked up at the sky and thought about a man who had no claws, no armor, no psionics, no venom, no wings, no telepathy, no regeneration. A man who had nothing at all except a flashlight, a pistol, 3 watches, and 10,000 years of stubborn refusal to stay down. And she thought that was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. The galaxy was very old and very vast and full of wonders that could break the mind with their beauty and